Hello, everyone. My name is Gilda Ross. I'm the Glenbard Student and Community Projects Coordinator. I'm delighted that you could be with us tonight for this very, very important conversation. We have been waiting for this conversation to happen for many, many months. When I first heard about Dr. Nock being available to be our authority, I was over the moon, and I'm glad that you can be here on this very important Suicide Awareness Month event. So I'm glad you could make the time to join us. I'm grateful to all of our sponsors. You saw the slide of the people who make this all possible. We couldn't do it without them, and we couldn't do it without you as well. We always want people to know that these programs are available for friends in your community or friends across the country. Everybody is welcome to these virtual programs. We have 50 programs each year that you can check out our brochure at glenbardgps.org, and you'll find programs for the very youngest of children to 20 and 30-year-olds. And there's always something, always some takeaway. And tonight, you will also have some very important takeaways. So it's Suicide Awareness Month. I'm glad that you could join us. It's a serious and critically important conversation. Before we begin, very briefly, I want to tell you about what's upcoming. Next week, we were just discussing a program next week, but before that happens, we have Frank Palmisani coming back to talk about financial aid. That is on the 7th. That will be at 7 p.m. And then Lisa DeMoore will be returning. She has an important new book, The Emotional Lives of Teenagers. It's a playbook for thriving in trying times. She will be with us next Wednesday, the 13th. She will be there at noon and at 7 p.m. And I hope you can, once again, share if you are a social media person, like us on Facebook and retweet and let everybody know that these conversations are really here for everyone. And the week following, we're going to talk about the importance of mattering and having your child feel as though they have value beyond a grade or beyond a performance. And that discussion will be led by Shelley Tigliski. She'll be with us on Wednesday, the 19th, Tuesday, the 19th at noon and at 7 p.m. We also have a program in Spanish helping our families who speak Spanish learn everything they need to know about college admission. And we finish out the month with a community read, another conversation about how we can matter and how our children can matter and how one person can make a difference. And the book we have been reading is The Promise of a Pencil, and that is on Wednesday, September 27th at 7 p.m. So you want to circle your calendar and share the resource. Without further ado, we're going to begin this critically important event, and thank you again for the honor of your time. And without further ado, I'm going to introduce, it's my pleasure to introduce Janet Cook. She is the Assistant Superintendent of Student Services for the Glenbard Schools. Janet?
Thank you so much, Gilda. I want to introduce Dr. Matt Nock. His research is aimed at advancing the understanding of why people behave in ways that are harmful to themselves, with an emphasis on suicide and other forms of self-harm. This work is funded by grants from the National Institutes of Health and several private foundations. Dr. Nock's work has been recognized through the receipt of several career awards from the American Psychological Association, the Association for Behavioral and Cognitive Therapies, the American Association of Suicidology, and others too numerous to mention. In 2001, Dr. Nock was named a MacArthur Fellow. In addition to conducting research, Dr. Nock has been a consultant and scientific advisor to the National Institutes of Health, the World Health Organization, and many others. At Harvard, Professor Nock serves as chair of their psychology department, and he has received several important awards for distinguished teaching. We are delighted to welcome here to the Glenbard Parent Series for this critical conversation. Welcome, Dr. Nock.
Thank you so much, Janet, for that introduction. And thank you so much, Gilda, for organizing and for inviting me to participate in this really exciting series. And thank you all for joining. As mentioned, my name is Matt Nock. I'm a professor and chair of the psychology department at Harvard. And I'll be talking to you today about some recent advances in our understanding and ability to predict and prevent suicidal and self-injurious behavior. And my goal for this meeting is to talk with you for about 40 minutes or so about some recent advances in our understanding, prediction, and prevention, to leave time for questions and discussion at the end. And I look forward to speaking with you about this topic and any questions you might have. So let's jump right in. So to start out, why have a meeting about this topic? Why I spent the past 25 years of my life studying suicide and self-injury, and why is this something that you should be interested in or potentially concerned about? Well, suicide is a major public health problem that's been with us since the beginning of recorded history. Data from the World Health Organization tell us that about 1 million people die by suicide each year around the world, which means one person takes their life about every 40 seconds. So just concretely speaking, by the time we finish meeting here, about another 100 people have died by their own hand. There are nearly 50,000 deaths by suicide each year in the US. And to put this in context, this means there's more than 5 times as many suicides as HIV/AIDS related deaths, more than twice as many suicides as homicides in the US each year. And if we think about suicides versus homicides, around the globe every year, more people die by suicide than all homicides, wars, genocides combined. So we're each more likely to die by our own hand than we are by someone else's, which I think is a pretty staggering fact, and something that we don't hear a lot about because the media focuses a lot, as they should, on interpersonal violence, but inward directed violence is an even bigger problem that doesn't get nearly as much and nearly enough attention. In the US, suicide is the 10th leading cause of all death. For those of us who are parents or teachers or work with young folks, I'm not just a clinical scientist, I'm a licensed clinician and a father of 3 young folks, ages 10 to 17. Suicide in the US is the 2nd leading cause of death, behind only accidents, among those ages 10 to 35. So something that those of us who work as parents and as teachers should be especially aware of. And from a parental perspective, I think important to know that although suicide death is relatively rare in time and space, suicidal thoughts and behaviors are pretty common in adolescents. Data from the Center for Disease Control, the CDC, does an annual survey of high school students around the country, and those data tell us that about nearly 1 in 5 high school students in the US say that they've seriously considered suicide in the past year, and the rates there are more than nearly double for girls as they are for boys, and nearly 1 in 10 say that they've made a suicide attempt in the past year. And again, the rates are higher there for girls than for boys. And this is each year. So this is just in the past year. So this is something that's relatively common in our schools, in our youth. And so I think something that we should all be certainly aware of and ideally knowledgeable about. And my goal in my talk to you today is to severalfold. One, I really want to demystify and get you more comfortable with, familiar with the idea of suicide. And in thinking about an analogy of what is this like that we know about, I often come to the idea of severe weather events like tornadoes. And I think suicide, we can think of similarly to severe weather events in several ways. One, they're relatively rare, but they're important. When they occur, they take lives away from us. And so because they occur so infrequently, they're somewhat mysterious. Certainly they were more so hundreds, thousands of years ago. Because they don't happen that often, and because they're so severe, there's a lot of mystery around them. There's a lot of uncertainty around them. They're complex. There's no one factor that causes severe weather events. We now know about weather systems that form, and we're starting to learn the same about suicide. And as I'll talk about today, there's no one cause of suicide or of self-injury. We're learning that these behaviors are the result of a combination of many different factors. These phenomena are really poorly understood. They've been around since the beginning of recorded history. And only the past few decades have we gotten a better sense of why they happen, when they're going to occur, and what steps we can take to keep ourselves safe. They're difficult to predict in time and place, but with better data that we've gotten over the past few decades, and in the case of suicide, the past decade or so, we're getting a much better understanding of who is at high risk and when are people at highest risk. We're learning how we can collect data and find emerging patterns that lead people to engage in suicidal and self-injurious behaviors. And we're getting better at identifying among those at risk, when are they most at risk? And I'll touch on each of these in our time together today. So by way of outline, what I want to talk about is first, what is it? What are suicidal thoughts and behaviors? What is self-injury? So that as I move through this talk and talk about these different thoughts and behaviors, we're all clear on what it is we're discussing. Who is most at risk? Why do people do it? Why do people engage in suicidal and self-injurious behavior? how can we best detect and predict these thoughts and behaviors? And perhaps most importantly, what can we do to best prevent them? And so I'll spend a few minutes on each of these topics, again, trying to leave about 15 minutes or so for discussion at the end. And in my comments, I'm a clinical psychologist, a behavioral scientist. I lead a research team of about 35 researchers who, at Harvard for the past 20 years, we've been doing studies, conducting studies, scientific studies, trying to understand, predict, and prevent suicide. I'm going to share the results of a lot of studies that have been done, and my presentation is going to be very data focused. I don't want to speak a lot in metaphor. I want to speak about hard facts and about what we've learned, again, to try and really demystify, break down, and share the most cutting edge science with you. I'm also, though, as a parent and an uncle and someone with friends with kids, I'm gonna try and share really practical take-home advice as I move throughout my comments. So I'll talk a little bit about what the science says, and then what I'd encourage you to take home from that and take action on in your life if and when appropriate. Okay, so I'll start with what is it that we're talking about? Perhaps clearest is suicide. Suicide is the act of intentionally ending one's own life. I'll also talk a fair amount, and you might hear psychologists and psychiatrists and social workers talk about some of these precursors to suicide, the things that lead up to suicide. When we think about suicidal ideation or suicidal thoughts of intentionally ending one's own life, making a suicide plan, so selecting a method with having some intention of acting in the future, which we think about a step beyond just suicidal thoughts, and a suicide attempt, which is self-injurious behavior with some intention of dying. And we distinguish this, especially in the past 10, 15 years, from non-suicidal self-injury, which we often abbreviate as NSSI, which is self-injury that's non-suicidal. There's no intention of dying, often taking the form of cutting or burning the skin. And we've, for a long time, the field sort of lumped suicidal and non-suicidal self-injury together, but we've learned over the past decade or so, these are really quite distinct behaviors with different courses, different correlates, different indicated treatments. And I'll talk a little bit about that distinction and about self-injury in particular. Okay, so now I want to move to talk in more detail about who is most at risk. Suicide occurs all around the world, and this is a heat map showing, and some of these maps I'm going to show are just a few years old. Data take a few years to come out from the CDC and from the World Health Organization. What this map shows is that suicide occurs everywhere around the world. The heat map shows, as the colors darken, the rates increase. There's no sort of consistent geographical pattern, north, south, east, west. We see the US is about middle of the road in terms of overall rate of suicide. There are some common sex differences in the US and around the world. So these are data from the US Center for Disease Control. We see the suicide rate overall in the middle for the past roughly 20 years. And there's a big difference between males and females, where males die by suicide about 4 times as often as females do. This is true in the US, and it's true in virtually every country around the world very consistently over time. In the US, we also see racial and ethnic differences. Again, looking over the past roughly 20 years, we see consistently the suicide rate is highest for those classified as white and American Indian, and it's lower for folks who are Black, Asian, and other racial ethnic groups. About 90% of all suicides in the US are among white people, and I have white in quotation marks here because this is race as defined by medical examiners. So by looking at a person when they have died and making a determination about how they classify their race. So about 90% are among white people, and putting this slide together with the prior one, about 70% of all suicides in the US are among white men. We also see age differences that are pretty consistent over time. This is true in the US and globally. One thing to note here is you'll notice this blue line sticking out of the pack. This is those who are under 15 years old. Suicide, as I'll talk more about, is quite uncommon in children. And you'll see the rates really jump to this next line, 15 to 24. So there's a huge increase in adolescence and young adulthood in suicide risk. And then we don't see a huge distinction in age groups beyond that. Again, highlighting that this adolescent period is a really high risk time. So for a very long time, we didn't have good data on the rate of suicidal thoughts, plans, and attempts in the US and around the world. And we also hadn't had a good understanding of the characteristics of suicidal thoughts and behaviors. When do they occur? How do they change over time? What are the key risk factors? That's changed in the past 10 or 15 years through a project done in collaboration with the World Health Organization called the World Mental Health Survey Initiative, led by Ron Kessler at Harvard Medical School. And in this study, what Kessler and colleagues did was collect nationally representative data from thousands of families in household surveys. They get a random sample of people around the US, thousands of them, and interview them to ask questions about their experience of suicidal thoughts and behaviors and a range of other different mental disorders and potential risk factors. And this study was replicated in several dozen countries across the Americas, Africa, Europe, Asia, and the Pacific, with all data collected around the world and sent back to Harvard Medical School for analysis. And Dr. Kessler and his team analyzed these data, and I want to share some of what was found. What we see is the prevalence, so the rate of suicidal ideation plans and attempts overall around the world is 9%, 3%, and about 3%. So the percent of people who ever think about suicide throughout their lives is almost 10%. So again, fairly common, relatively speaking, and around 3% of people make a suicide attempt ever. These rates vary pretty dramatically across countries. For those in the US and New Zealand are consistently the highest, with about 5%, 5%, and 15% having a suicide attempt plan and ideation. We don't understand why there's so much cross-national variability. Interestingly, though, although there's a lot of variability in the base rates of these things around the world, there's almost universal consistency in several characteristics of suicidal thoughts and behaviors. There's consistency in terms of age of onset of suicidal thoughts. In every country we examine, so this is 17 different countries, the first 17 we have data on. Don't worry about which line is which. Each line is a different country, displayed here. What I want to note is that, so what this shows is risk of suicidal thoughts given year of life. And we see in the bottom left here, from birth till about age 12, virtually no one thinks about suicide, maybe about age 10. And then we see all of these lines skyrocket into young adulthood. So this period from adolescence into young adulthood, in every country, every culture around the world, there's a huge increase in risk of thinking about suicide. So that seems to be something of a universal. There's also consistency in the probability of transitioning from having suicidal thoughts to making a suicide plan or making a suicide attempt, regardless of base rate. In virtually every culture, every country we examine, about a third of people who think about suicide will ever make a plan or will ever make an attempt, which again, as parents, as family members, it's helpful to know that just because the person has thoughts of suicide does not mean they're going to try and kill themselves. About a third of the time does a person with suicide ever make a suicide attempt. The timing of that first suicide attempt is also pretty consistent cross-nationally. This figure shows, for those who have made a suicide attempt, how many years passed before they made an attempt since they first started having suicidal thinking. And again, don't worry about which line is which. What I want to note is the majority of the time, 60% of the time or more, if a person's going to make a suicide attempt, they're going to make it in the first year after the onset of suicidal thoughts. So if a person first starts thinking about suicide at age 15, the time from 15 to 16 is the highest risk time for making a suicide attempt. The longer a person goes having thoughts of suicide without making an attempt in years, the less likely they are to make an attempt, which seems a little perhaps counterintuitive. If someone's been thinking about suicide for 10 years, you might think they're really at risk, but it seems to be something protective about having the thought but not acting on it. That protects people in the long run. So that first year after onset is one where we should be especially cautious. And we also see consistency in the risk factors for the onset of suicidal thoughts, plans, and attempts. Consistently around the globe, being female, being younger, as people get into early adulthood, being unmarried, are all risk factors. And the presence of mental disorder is a risk factor. And that's one that I'll spend a little bit more time on because it is so prevalent in those who are suicidal. Studies of people who die by suicide show that about 90 to 95% of people who die by suicide had a mental disorder before they died. Not always diagnosed, but had the symptoms of at least one mental disorder. And having 2 or 3 or 4 disorders really increases the risk. And we also have learned a little bit about the type of disorders that increase risk and increase risk of different kinds of suicidal outcomes. So if I asked you, what kind of disorder do you think would be most associated with thinking about suicide? You'd probably say depression or major depressive disorder. And what I'm going to show is which disorders. I'm only showing 4 here for clarity. There's 16 that we looked at in this model, which are most predictive of suicidal ideation, of suicidal thinking. And what I'm showing here are odds ratios. So increase in the odds of suicidal thinking, given the presence of depression. There's a doubling in your odds, roughly doubling in your risk of thinking about suicide if you have depression. But most disorders are associated with a little increase in your risk. So if you have an anxiety disorder like PTSD, you have a 50% increase in your odds of thinking about suicide at some point. If you have a conduct problem, have trouble controlling your behavior, stealing, getting into fights, that increases your odds by about 50%. Having an alcohol use disorder increases your odds by about 80%. The next question we ask is, among those who have suicidal thoughts, what predicts actually making a suicide attempt? And there, depression does nothing. So an odds ratio of 1 means there's no increase, no more, you're not any more likely than those without depression to make a suicide attempt. What does really increase your risk is having a disorder characterized by anxiety, agitation, or poor behavioral control. Now, putting this together suggests that perhaps depression gets people thinking about suicide, but not acting on those thoughts. Other disorders, anxiety, conduct problems, alcohol, substance use, get people acting on their thoughts of suicide. And perhaps that's why it is that multiple disorders really increase the risk of suicidal behavior. So again, take home here is just because a person is depressed doesn't mean they're going to make a suicide attempt. And just because a person's thinking about suicide doesn't mean they're going to make an attempt. Just because your child or spouse or friend has a mental disorder or meets criteria for mental disorder doesn't mean they're at high risk. It's really the accumulation of multiple disorders and multiple risk factors that puts a person at risk. We've identified beyond mental disorders a wide range of risk factors. This is a figure showing odds ratios. I just showed from a meta-analysis or a study of studies that we did looking at the past 50 years of research on suicide. What are the strongest risk factors for suicide? We see treatment history being in treatment for a psychiatric problem triples your risk, probably not because treatment is making people more suicidal, but because people who are suicidal get themselves into treatment. After that, we see a family history of suicidal thoughts or behaviors, having psychopathology, or also known as a mental disorder, having prior self-injurious thoughts and behaviors, social stressors, physical illnesses, and so on. Each one ticks up your risk just a little bit. A take-home here is there's no one risk factor to be looking out for. We think about suicide as occurring as a result of the interaction of lots of different risk factors, each one piling on a little bit and putting a person at slightly higher risk. So another take-home here is there's not one thing to be on the lookout for, but the piling up of lots of different stressors or risk factors. And in fact, over several studies, we found if you simply count up the number of risk factors for suicide that a person has, this gives you a fairly good indication of their level of risk. So we looked at the top 12 risk factors that we could identify, and I just looked at a few different samples of people to see what happens if we just say who has 0 to 3 factors, 4 to 6, 7 to 9, 10 to 12. And we put people into different groups based on number of risk factors. So those with 0 to 3, we call the very low risk group. That was about 19% of the sample. None of them made a suicide attempt in the next year. Those with 4 to 6 risk factors, that was about half the sample. So all of us, these risk factors included age, race, sex, and so on. Which of those factors put a person at higher risk? About half of people have them. Only 3% of those folks made a suicide attempt in the next year. What about 7 to 9 risk factors? We call that intermediate risk. That was only 16% of the sample, but 20% of them made a suicide attempt in the next year. What about people with 10 to 12 risk factors? That was the smallest group, only 13% of the sample, but nearly 80% of that group made a suicide attempt in the next year. And that represented 2/3 of all suicide attempts. So again, just thinking about number of risk factors a person has can tell us their overall level of risk. And we found this looking at data in the US, and this replicates across a few dozen countries. More recently, in the past few years, our group and many other groups have been using newer, more sophisticated approaches, for instance, using machine learning applied to healthcare data to look at hundreds, thousands of potential risk factors at a time and trying to build algorithms that can tell us in a healthcare system, in a university, in an outpatient clinic, which patients have risk factors, a profile of risk factors that put them at high risk, and can we start informing primary care physicians or universities or psychiatrists or psychology offices about which patients are most at risk? And we're starting to implement some of these models now. So we're hopeful that in the next few years, these will start to become more widely available and actionable in communities. I want to switch to talk now a little bit about why people become suicidal or self-injurious. And there have been theories of suicide for hundreds, thousands of years. And they varied a little bit over time, and they overlap to some degree. I don't believe any of them fully, but I'll share them just to sort of highlight what the thinking in this has been and how it's changed. Some of the major theories of suicide have proposed that suicide results from, this is from sociologist Emil Durkheim over 100 years ago, a very influential scholar who suggested that suicide results from the breakdown of social integration. And we still think that, you know, being isolated, being disconnected is important, but it's just part of the picture. Freud described suicide as anger at another person turned inward. There is some correlation between anger and hostility and aggressiveness and suicide, but again, this seems like only a piece of the puzzle. More recently, Neuringer talked about suicide as being a problem of cognitive rigidity. And there are data showing that when people move into a suicidal state, they to some extent have blinders on. They have trouble generating solutions to problems, and do worse on tests of decision making and problem solving. So, you know, people's cognition, their thoughts does seem to become rigid when they're suicidal. But again, that's part of the picture. Perhaps most impactfully, Edwin Schneidman talked about suicide as an attempt to escape from psychological pain. And we've done research studies where we've interviewed people who have made suicide attempts and survived. And this is far and away the #1 response that people give. They say they tried to kill themselves to escape from intense, seemingly intolerable psychological pain. As I mentioned, we have newer models that integrate dozens, hundreds of factors at a time. We're trying to build and test new theories of suicide. A take home here is there's no simple satisfactory explanation. And I wouldn't believe any of these, and I wouldn't believe anybody's theory about one thing or two things or three things that might cause suicide. But if I were to synthesize these, I don't want to have you walk away here with nothing and no explanation. I would say the strongest evidence is that suicide is an attempt to escape from seemingly intolerable circumstances. Why? We don't know. Do some people feel such intense psychological pain in response to things in their environment or things that happen with them psychologically? We don't know. Why do some people have trouble tolerating that pain? Why do some people have a tendency to try and escape sooner rather than later, or generating or implementing other possible solutions? We don't know, and those are things that we're doing research to actively try and investigate. But if you know somebody who's struggling with suicidal thoughts, chances are they may be experiencing intense psychological pain and thinking about suicide as a way to escape from it. It's somewhat rare for people to say, I want to die to be dead or to, you know, reunite with a loved one. It's most often, I don't want to feel what I'm feeling and I want to stop feeling it for a little while, and suicide seems like a way to make that happen. I want to switch gears and talk a little bit about non-suicidal self-injury. So this is, again, direct, deliberate destruction of one's own body tissue in the absence of any intent to die. These are some images just off the internet about what this looks like. It's often cutting, burning, inserting objects under the skin. It happens in adults, in the community, in clinical settings at far lower rates than it does among adolescents in the community. Again, around 15 to 20, 25% of kids, and much higher rates in clinical settings like outpatient clinics and inpatient clinics. Why do people engage in self-injury? Again, there have been theories for a very long time, a wide range of explanations going back to biblical times, where self-injury was described as attempts to escape demons from the body that have possessed the body. More recently, psychoanalysts thought about suicide self-injury and wrote about it as expressed anger at another person, attempts to draw a boundary between self and parent, attempts at sexual gratification. Interesting explanations, but with virtually no data to support them. Psychiatrists for several decades have described self-injury as resulting from depression or anxiety or borderline personality, in part because we tend to see elevated rates of depression and anxiety and other disorders in people who engage in self-injury, But that's not really an explanation about why people engage in self-injury. It's just a description of some of the things that are correlated with it. So there's been increasing research on self-injury over the past, especially 20 years or so. So this is a figure that shows the number of articles published each year on self-injury, and known by several other terms. And we see it's virtually absent, very little work, less than 100 articles per year in the 1990s. And then since 2000, there's been huge increases in research on self-injury. And one model has emerged that's gotten pretty consistent support is this functional model of self-injury that suggests self-injury is performed, it's maintained by four functions, by four reinforcement pathways. And these vary based on whether it's positive reinforcement or negative reinforcement. And I'll define those, taking us all back to Psych 101. And by whether that reinforcement is intrapersonal or internal within the person, or interpersonal or external between the person and someone else. Now, positive reinforcement, to take us back, refers to an increase in the frequency of a behavior following the presentation of a favorable stimulus. In other words, you perform a behavior, you get something good, you're more likely to perform that behavior. You go to work, you get paid, you're more likely to go to work. You play the lottery, you win, you're more likely to play the lottery. So you get something positive that reinforces your behavior. Negative reinforcement, a little bit trickier, increase in the frequency of behavior following the removal of an aversive event or condition. People often confuse this with punishment. It's not the application of something negative, it's the removal of something negative. So for instance, you go outside, it's raining, you're getting wet, you put up an umbrella, you stop the rain with the umbrella, you're much more likely to use an umbrella in the future to stop the rain. You go outside and it's cold, you put on a jacket, you remove the negative thing, you're reinforced for putting on a jacket. Now, if we apply this to why people might engage in self-injury, a person might do it for intrapersonal, internal, negative reinforcement. That is, to remove tension or some other aversive internal state, or more plainly, to stop bad feelings. This is far and away the #1 reason that people engage in non-suicidal self-injury by their own report and by laboratory studies and field studies we've done. We don't know exactly what the mechanism is, whether it's that hurting yourself causes pain, pain demands attention, you now focus on the pain rather than the other things that were bothering you. Whether there's a physiological mechanism, there does seem to be. If you're injured, your heart slows down, it slows the pumping of blood, that relaxes the person. So maybe this is something of a hijacking of this evolutionarily protective pathway. We're still trying to figure this out, but it seems clear that this is the primary driver of self-injury. People do it to stop bad feelings. One could also engage in self-injury for interpersonal positive reinforcement to generate some desired state, to feel something, for self-stimulation. If you feel absolutely nothing, you could do this to try and feel alive, to feel pleasure in some way. There are also interpersonal functions. A person might engage in self-injury to get some attention or access to resource, to convey to others how much they're hurting. And I've heard people say, in passing, well, they're just doing this for attention. I would argue if someone's cutting their skin and burning their skin to communicate, then there's some real pain there that a person's trying to communicate that should be attended to. And a person might engage in self-injury for interpersonal negative reinforcement, to remove a demand for something, to get your parents to stop fighting, to get kids to stop bullying you at school. So there could be, and kids report, some interpersonal functions, but again, this intrapersonal negative one's the primary driver. And treatments are, as a result, focused on trying to figure out and teach ways of stopping bad thoughts and bad feelings that don't rely on hurting yourself. What are some healthier ways that we can have you feel better to remove those negative feelings? And we'll talk a little bit more about that. Okay, so how do we best detect and predict suicidal thoughts? Moving back to suicide. Data have shown us for several decades, about 2/3 of people who die by suicide told someone ahead of time they were thinking about killing themselves or thinking about death or not being around anymore. So I would, if you take nothing else from this talk, please take, if you suspect someone might be at risk for suicide, might be having thoughts of suicide, you should absolutely 100% ask them if they are having thoughts about suicide or thoughts of self-injury. There's been a long-standing concern on parents and teachers and others that if I ask someone if they're suicidal and they're not, this will give them the thought or really freak them out or increase their risk. That is not true. And this has been tested in experiments where some people get asked about suicide, some don't. When people get asked about suicide, it does not increase their distrust. It does not increase their risk. It does not give them the idea. If your kids are like mine, you might get eye rolls. If I ask what do you want for dinner? Are you going to soccer practice today? I don't always get a positive response. The same might be true here, but you're more likely to have a positive outcome than a negative, and you're very unlikely to do harm by asking. So I'd really encourage you to ask. Asking is easier said than done. Talking about suicide, talking about death, talking about self-injury can be difficult. I've been doing this work for over 2 decades, and it's still a little uncomfortable to broach this subject with patients, with family members, with friends. I would encourage you, as I do, to try and work up to it. So I don't start with, are you thinking about killing yourself? I typically start with, you seem like you're pretty sad and down lately. Is that true? How are you feeling? Are you feeling really depressed? And then might move into, are things so bad that you've had thoughts about dying or not being around anymore? Have you had thoughts of hurting yourself? And I might work up to, have you had thoughts of killing yourself? I would encourage you to ask these in a, as my colleague Barry Walsh says, a calm, dispassionate demeanor. I often think about the old Detective Columbo, who just sort of asking in a curious, inquisitive way about, what are you experiencing? What is happening here? I would not ask this in the negative, which I know people often want to do, to say, you're not thinking about suicide, are you? You're not thinking about hurting yourself, are you? I think it's done out of nervousness and because people really want to hear no. But I would encourage you to give people the space to say yes, and try and ask this in a really balanced way. You might learn that they are thinking about suicide and they didn't want to say anything about it, and you open up the channel of communication to hear about it. It might be the case that your adolescent, your teen, your student, your loved one is not thinking about suicide, but now they know that they can come to you if they are having that thought, and you've also modeled for them that it's okay to talk about these things, and you've modeled how you ask these questions. So I am of the belief that it's always a good thing. It's very rarely not a good thing to ask these questions and have these conversations. Clinicians are often trained to do this and to ask in these ways. And just for your own information, if they get a yes to thoughts of killing yourself, what we ask about next is, how strong is your desire? I always ask on a scale of 0 to 10 clinically and in our research to get a sense of where you're, how is this a passing thought, a passing desire, or is it really intense? Do you have a plan? And what is your intention of acting? And again, there too, we ask on a scale of 0 to 10. Is it 0? You have the thought, and some kids will have a thought of suicide and be incredibly distressed by it. It's involuntary, it's unfamiliar, it's unwanted. And sometimes it's more comfortable and in some ways wanted, and they're having an intention to act. And that's helpful and important to gauge as well. But I'd encourage you to if you detect suicidal thinking or self-injurious thinking, to seek out help from a clinician. We can't only rely on self-report. There are problems with doing so. Although we should ask people if they're thinking about suicide, there's often a motivation to deny or conceal thoughts of suicide on the part of the person. People don't want to be hospitalized. We know that suicidal thoughts, as I'll talk about in a moment, are transient in nature. They tend to come and go. And so they may not be there when you ask, but could return a little while later. We also know that people lack conscious awareness, all of us do, of our level of risk of different kinds of behaviors. And we also are not good reporters on what we're going to do in the future. We know this is true for suicide because although 2/3 of people who die by suicide said they were thinking of suicide before they died, nearly 80% explicitly denied suicidal thoughts or intentions in their last communication before dying. And this is one of the trickiest things, where people who are thinking about suicide often tell someone else, but then they recant and say, no, but now I'm not thinking about suicide. And so it gets really difficult to know what their level of thinking is. So we're working on new methods of assessing suicide risk that don't rely just on a person's self-report. So for instance, we might have a person in front of us saying, I don't want to kill myself. But what we are still struggling with trying to understand is, what might that person be thinking about suicide that they may not be telling us? What are their unspoken thoughts or their implicit cognitions, as we call them in psychology? They're implicit meaning they're not said explicitly, cognitions meaning thoughts. So what are people thinking that they may not be telling us? We've developed methods of measuring, we as a field developed methods of measuring implicit cognitions. There's a wonderful test called the implicit association test, developed by 3 psychologists, Tony Greenwald, Mahzarin Banaji, and Brian Nosek. And it shows people different stimuli, different images or words in the center of the screen, and asks them to classify them on the left and right based on some descriptors. And I'm going to show you a version that asks people to describe or to classify words as being death-related or life-related, and like me or not like me. But before I do, I want to share the logic of this test. It uses your classification speed measured in milliseconds to get a sense of how you're thinking about different concepts of interest. So allow me to give a brief example. Imagine I said, classify on one side of the screen. I'm going to show you pictures, and I want you to classify basketball players and tall related words on one side, jockeys and short related words on the other side. And then one at a time, I had these different stimuli appear, and you'd classify basketball tall, jockey short. You'd be pretty fast at doing that. If now I said, okay, now we're going to have you pair basketball with short, jockey with tall, and I showed you images, it would take you a little bit longer to do that because you don't associate jockeys with tall, you associate jockeys with short. So things that we classify things more quickly that we associate with each other. Now, using that logic, we developed a suicide implicit association test with the idea that if you're thinking about death, you'll be faster when death and me are paired together. If you want to be alive, you're thinking about life, you'll be faster when life and me are paired together. So I'll show an example of how this works. So we sit down people in front of the computer, we have death or life related words appear, me or not me words appear, and they have to classify them. So play along with me. I'll just say where this should be classified. So this is a death word, so we push a key on the left of our keyboard. So this goes on the left. 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 Right. Right. You can say this at home with me to get a feel for this. Right. Left. So you see death and me are paired here. Left. Left. Okay, now we'll do 20 trials where life and me are paired. We do the same task. Left, left, right, right, left, left. So hopefully you'll be faster when life and me are paired together if you identify with life. We tested this in a sample of people, and of those, this is a high-risk group that we worked with. Of those who were faster when life and me were paired, we call that an identification with life, 10% made a suicide attempt during this follow-up period. These are patients coming to the hospital for suicide risk. So they were already at high risk. Of those who were fast responding when death and me were paired, they had 3 times the rate of suicide attempt. So we use this behavioral test to figure out which patients were most at risk for suicide. And this test outperformed clinicians' predictions of who was at risk. It outperformed people's own prediction of whether they were going to make a suicide attempt. We observed these effects, these replicated across a few different studies. We observed these in the general population. And we've been collecting data via this platform, and you can check it out yourself. It's up and running, Project Implicit Health, and you can take and get feedback on implicit association tests related to suicide, self-injury. It's all anonymous. You don't have to put your name. You don't have to even see your results, but it's a way for us to sort of share information with the public about implicit cognitions and mental health. And also it's a demonstration website where we can collect data and ask questions with anonymous data about implicit associations about suicide, self-injury, and a range of different other outcomes. And this test can be delivered on any computer, smartphone, tablet. And so I show this as an example of how we're trying to identify objective ways that don't rely on self-report to identify people at risk for suicide and self-injury to help us get more accurate in our predictions. And I'm going to end, and I'll try and go quickly here to leave time for a conversation about what we can do to prevent these outcomes. If you know that someone's having thoughts of suicide, I would encourage you to seek help from a professional as soon as possible, and or pick up a phone and dial 988, which is the US new national number for psychiatric crisis. 911 is for emergencies. 988 is for the National Crisis Line. You do 1-800-273-TALK. It is now 988 for simplicity, and you can talk to anybody anonymously or 24/7 around the country. Or go to your local emergency room or see a clinician. When you go to the ER, people are often afraid to go for suicide risk. It's just like if you have a broken arm or a cut that needs attention. You go in with a person, by yourself, with your team. You see a clinician, you get an evaluation, they make a determination about whether you're best treated by a clinician that they'll refer you to in your community, or if you should stay in the hospital for a day or 3 days to keep you safe for further evaluation, or slightly longer for more immediate treatment. It often can be scary. It often is portrayed in a really negative, scary way in movies, which is where people get their first impression of it. But it's the same hospital you go to, the same emergency room that you go to for a physical injury, you go to for psychiatric help as well. So I'd really encourage you to consider that if it's available in your community. In terms of frontline psychological interventions, the data suggests that the two most effective for suicide and self-injury risk are ones called dialectical behavior therapy, or DBT, and or cognitive behavior therapy, or CBT. These are the ones that I look for friends, family members who are suicidal, self-injurious, and need of help. They can be difficult to find. What I use is this website, findcbt.org/FAT, to find a therapist. This is a tool of an organization called the Association of Behavioral and Cognitive Therapies, ABCT. It's an organization with a big focus on evidence-based treatment, what psychological treatments have been shown to work. And you can go in and put in your zip code and indicate, are you looking for an adolescent, for couples therapy, for family therapy, and you can find a clinician who's likely to know evidence-based treatments like DBT or CBT near you. I can't guarantee you'll be successful, but again, this is what I use. When a friend or relative contacts me from another part of the country, I go right to this website and try and find a clinician in their area. And what this clinician is going to do, what they should do, is careful monitoring and a suicide risk assessment to get a sense of not just what's this person's level of risk right now, but how is it changing over time. And this is an area where there's been really exciting developments over the past 5-10 years, as we've all started to carry smartphones and engage more with these digital tools. As parents, many of us are not happy about how much time our kids are spending on phones or other digital devices, but they provided a really, and I agree, and they provide a new opportunity to do what my colleague J.P. O'Neill at Harvard Medical School has called digital phenotyping, or this basically capturing moment by moment information about individuals in their natural environment. And so we've done studies where, and I'll move quickly through this in the interest of time, where we find people who say, I'm having serious thoughts of suicide, and we put apps on their phone with their consent that ping them about 4 times a day with questions like this. Right now, what's your desire to kill yourself, your intention to kill yourself, your ability to resist the urge to kill yourself? And again, we've done experiments with these too to see, does asking people repeatedly about suicide make them more distressed or make them more suicidal? It does not. And what we see is, so each of these gray tiles is a different person. On the horizontal axis is a 1-month passage of time. On the vertical axis is basically adding up those 3 questions, so severity of suicidal thinking. What you'll see is a lot of variability between people, so people look very different from each other, and within people. Suicidal thoughts are not static over time. They tend to ebb and flow quite a bit. And these are all people who have said, I'm having serious thoughts of suicide. That looks very different across people and within people. We did something called a latent profile analysis to tell us, are there some latent or underlying profiles in these data? I'm going to show you these same data just reorganized. We found 5 different profiles. So these are the same data reorganized. We saw this group who has a low average suicidal thoughts, a lot of zeros with a few 1s and 2s. This next group in yellow, low average but high variability. They were peakier. In purple, moderate average, moderate variability. In red, high average, low variability. They never come down to 0. And in blue, high average, high variability. Which group is most likely to have made a suicide attempt? It's the red group. And that tracks post hoc that, if you've got high suicidal thinking and no relief, thinking about escaping from an intolerable state, that person might be most likely to make a suicide attempt. We've replicated this in a separate sample, and now we're doing longer term studies. This is 1 month at a time. We're now doing 6-month studies to try and see, do people move from one profile to the next? When are people most likely to make a suicide attempt? And we're also incorporating data on sleep from GPS trackers, from accelerometer, heart rate variability measured by wrist-worn biosensors to try and build models that tell us not just who is at risk, but when are they most at risk, so that we can deploy digital interventions. And these are just a few examples that we've been developing. We've got a machine learning driven real-time chatbot. This is an intervention we developed with colleagues at a platform called Coco. Finds people who are at risk and then does a little chatbot interaction with them to troubleshoot potential barriers to treatment without any human in the loop. we found that people who get this have a 23% increase in their likelihood of calling the crisis line in the next few hours. We developed a game-like matching app that, like that game you might have played with your kids when they were younger, where you match Sally's face with Sally's face. But here, we ask people to pair self-injurious images, with naturally aversive images like snakes and spiders. And so we're basically classically conditioning people to have an aversion to suicide or self-injury. We did a randomized trial and it worked really well. Didn't believe the results. We did another trial. We did a third trial. Across trials, using this app led to a 20 to 60% reduction in self-injurious and suicidal behavior over the next 30 days. The effects went away after that. So we're now experimenting with longer versions and more tailored versions to try and make this more effective and get it into people's hands. And finally, we teamed up with a platform called The Mighty just recently. This is a blog post platform that have stories about, on their suicide section, about people working through suicidal thoughts and being happy they're alive, family members who have lost someone to suicide, how harmful and impactful that was. And we found 14 stories that people said really were really impactful for them. And we randomly assigned new visitors to the site to get these stories versus some neutral stories. And we found that people who got these really powerful, impactful stories, they got one a day for 2 weeks, they showed a reduction in their suicidal thinking, and it happened through increases in their hope about the future and their feelings of connectedness with others who had had similar experiences. So another really scalable, light touch way of trying to reach people in distress and drive down their risk of suicide. So I'll end there, and I hope that you took away a few points here. Suicidal thoughts and behaviors and self-injury are relatively common, although really alarming when they happen, relatively common in youth, about 15%, 20% experiencing these in a given year. Risk is highest in the first year after onset of suicidal thinking, and again, increases as the number of risk factors piles up. Clinically speaking, personally speaking, if you think someone that you know or love, or know and love, might be thinking about suicide or self-injury, I'd strongly encourage you to ask them about it and to explore the possibility of effective treatment like DBT or CBT, for instance, through this finder. And in terms of the future, we're working tirelessly on new methods of detecting suicide risk, increased monitoring, and trying to develop new low-cost, high-scalable interventions. So those are on the way, hopefully, in the next few years. And hopefully I will be able to come back and tell you about those in the future. In the meantime, thank you so much again to Gilda and team for the invitation, and thank you all for the opportunity to speak with you tonight. And I will stop there and look forward to any questions that you might have.
Such a wonderful opportunity to be with someone who's really on the cutting edge of all of this. This is new to me, and I'm certainly it's new to so many of us. I have a question. You give presentations like this to parents. What is the question you get asked most often when it comes to suicide?
Get asked a lot about why. You didn't talk about serotonin. You didn't talk about abuse. You didn't talk about personality disorders. I think there's a tendency to want, and this is true of society, and the media does this a lot. A gene for suicide has been discovered. A gene for happiness has been discovered. There's not a gene for, as scientist Ken Kendler has written really wonderfully about. There's no simple explanation for suicide. I know parents want it. I want it as someone who has known people and has lost people to suicide. There's not a simple explanation here. There's not a perfect prediction tool. There's not a treatment that's effective for everyone. So I get questions that I think feel like I have an undergirding of frustration that this is all we know. And I have the same frustration. I've been doing this for decades, and I'm a little embarrassed that we aren't better at this. We're not better at prediction than we are. We're not better at prevention than we are. It takes time. I think we're getting there. We've seen in the past 100 years, huge decreases in mortality rates due to leading causes of death. Like we've seen drops in mortality rate due to heart disease, cancers, tuberculosis, pneumonia, COVID recently, HIV, AIDS. We haven't seen the same for suicide. We haven't seen the science get done and get translated and put into practice. And this isn't what you asked, but I think it has to do a lot with stigma. And so I think the more people talk about this, talk to each other about it, you have meetings like this where you share information about it. I think that will help us make better progress. But that's the thing I get most is sort of a frustration with why don't we know more, and what about this other factor? Might this be the silver bullet that explains it?
Mhm. In line with that, you would say, I'm sure, the greatest myth is that we shouldn't talk about it. And I'm hearing more and more, have the conversation, ask. And I love the way you said, we don't go to it. It's not the first thing you say. We
Right.
build to it. What would you say is another important myth around suicide that people just don't understand, other than that one?
Yeah, there's no way to help people. If someone wants to do it, they're going to do it. There's no way to stop them.
Yes.
Boy, I've rarely, if ever, met somebody who was struggling with suicidal thoughts who didn't have tremendous ambivalence. There are some people who really want to die, but most people who are suicidal and who make suicide attempts don't. You know, they say, I don't know if I wanted to die. I wanted the pain to go away, so I took a bunch of pills to shut it off for a little while. I've seen instances where adolescents have taken pills just to sort of make things go away for a little while and died and you know, came to and said, well, wait, I'm dying. My organs are shutting down. I didn't want to die. And it's the saddest thing to see. Having suicidal thoughts is not destiny. It doesn't mean that a person really wants to die and they're going to do it. And we should sort of leave it to chance and think, well, if they're going to do it, they're going to do it. Again, the data suggests suicidal thoughts are transient. I didn't share this statistic. Only about half of people who have suicidal thoughts have them for just that 1 year and never have them again.
Mhm.
And so for me, a big goal is to, when someone's struggling with suicide, ask them about, have things always been this way? And often they haven't. And so I work with them and say, well, wouldn't it be great to get them to not be like this again? And with clinicians and with families, it's really, let's focus on keeping this person safe, because chances are, if we get them through this period, they're going to go on to have a really long, healthy, happy, productive life. It can be hard to see that when you're going through it, but the data suggests that's the case. So I think we should do what we can. It's not destiny. We should do what we can to keep people safe while they're working through this.
When I saw your chart about suicide it increasing at later stages of life, if I saw that right,
Yes.
um, how much of the adolescent brain is a factor of that impulsivity around
Yeah.
suicide?
Yeah. There's a great model developed by B.J. Casey and more recently Leah Somerville at Harvard. They call it the imbalance model, about how the adolescent brain develops. And to cartoon it a little bit, you know, the limbic system in our brain, the center of our brain, is sort of the gas, and our prefrontal cortex is sort of the brakes. And you know, the gas develops before the brakes do, and the brakes don't fully come online until early 20s. And so kids engage in a lot of risky behavior and a lot of reward-seeking behavior, and a lot of escape behavior, much more so than children do, and then do adults do. And it's because of this imbalance in systems, we think. So it's this period of adolescence where kids are riskier, they're experimenting with alcohol, with drugs, with self-injury, they're having suicidal thoughts, thinking different, you know, younger kids don't think a lot about death. It's more a cartoony version of, you know, Bugs Bunny and Roadrunner, and you don't really contemplate the finality of death until adolescence. And so this mix of things is sort of creates this risky time where kids are more independent, more risky, more sensation seeking, more depressed. Depression, anxiety also come online in early adolescence. And so this is a sort of a really risky time in terms of brain development and peer relations and family relations. And so this, I mean, we think this is why adolescence is it's an exciting time in many ways, but it's also a risky time in terms of mental health and adolescent safety.
The last question I'm going to ask you is something we talked about earlier today. As a psychologist, a clinical psychologist with a family, what are some parenting philosophies that you have when it comes to your own family and helping teens through this period of time?
Yeah, I think a lot about Marshall Linehan, the creator of dialectical behavior therapy, talks a lot about validation, about validating people's experience, about how difficult it is if we're talking to a teen, how difficult it is to go through what they're going through, and to try and have humility. Let them know that we don't have the answers. I'm not able to come in and fix what's wrong with you because I don't understand it, and I don't understand what you're going through. And I validate you are going through something tough. And my tendency certainly is to want to fix things for my kids. And I know that that hasn't been effective. That's not effective. And the data suggests it's not effective. An example that I like to use is from, you know, the idea of motivational interviewing. that's been developed and found to be really useful for substance use, for alcohol use. The model has long been, the Nancy Reagan, just say no, just don't do drugs, don't drink. And clinicians would say the same thing, just stop using. And it's not really effective. Motivational enhancement, where we say, well, what are the pros of drinking and using drugs? And acknowledging, validating, there is something good that people are getting out of it. Otherwise, they wouldn't be doing it. There is some reinforcement that people are getting from drinking, from using drugs. Now, what are the cons? What are the downsides? And if you ask them that way, you will get people to make an argument that, well, wait, there is some negative stuff happening here. Now, what do you want to happen? And how can I help you get there? And I think if we have that, what I try and do with patients and with family and friends is validate, have some humility, know that we don't have the answers, and just problem solve with what do you want? Where do you want to get? How can we help you get there? And what are the steps we take? What are the pros and cons? So a little bit of validation, a little bit of humility, and a little bit of putting your arm around the person and trying to be there with them and help them work through it rather than trying to fix it and make the problems go away, which I know as a parent, again, is what we want to do, to make our kids better and clear a path for them to be healthy and happy. But often, the way to do that is to take a step back and let them, let them work with you or have you work with them to help them get there.
Take a step back, let them work with it's been so much fun, really, even though you've made this topic so interesting as a researcher and a clinician. It's been a really special opportunity.
Thank you for having me. Thanks for covering it in this really important series. I really appreciate it.
And we'll be sharing this out, so there will be others that will be listening to this, and I really appreciate it. This is exactly at the point where we say we're all going to go hug the kids, and you gave us an opening for that just now. So we'll all do that. Thank you so much, Dr.
Thank you.
A very thorough and important conversation. You've talked to us about what we know universally, about what's on the horizon, and I know you're in the forefront of that research, and so I feel really fortunate about having you with us. We're going to look at the questions. I see there's one about street drugs and the effect. What effect do prescribed and or street drugs have on suicidal thoughts?
Yeah, that's a great and very broad question. I don't mean that in a bad way. There's a lot of nuance in there. I'll start with prescribed drugs. There's still active debate, especially around antidepressant medications like selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, or SSRIs, that a lot of us get prescribed if we're feeling depressed. These drugs have shown, these medications have shown to be effective in the treatment of depression. There's been some sense for the past 15, 20 years that they might increase risk of suicidal thoughts and behaviors, SSRIs, in young people in particular. And this led to, in 2002 or 3, a black box warning, a literal black box warning on the side of these medications. This debate is still ongoing, with some scientists saying the black box has caused an underprescription of antidepressants and an increase in suicide rate in adolescents. But experimental data show that compared to placebo, those who get antidepressants, SSRIs in particular, show an increase in suicidal thoughts or behaviors. And work in this area is ongoing, trying to figure out which medications are most helpful, with an eye toward let's make sure we identify which ones might be harmful. But I would say, and many say, even the black box warning doesn't say don't prescribe these. It says if you prescribe them, make sure you monitor carefully and look for the emergence of suicidal thoughts. I think that's the most important take home there. In terms of street drugs is broad. Drugs like, if you think about alcohol use increases risk. Stimulants, cocaine, opiates absolutely increase risk. There is sort of a new emerging area is on psychedelics and mental health conditions and suicide. There's some observational data and some empirical data suggesting that drugs like psilocybin, which often is in street drug form used as magic mushrooms, has some therapeutic effect and is associated with, in observational data, correlational data, people who have used psilocybin have lower rates of depression and suicidal thoughts and suicidal behaviors. Experimental data for suicide are less clear. So I said this is a broad question because putting psilocybin and MDMA and cocaine and opiates and SSRIs into the same bucket, there's going to be some substances are going to be helpful, some are going to be harmful, and there's probably going to be differential effects for different people. So I would not answer with a broad brush, and I'm trying to be as nuanced as I can, but there's a lot to unpack there. There's
a question here from a parent whose child was not my teen was very reluctant to engage in CBT, DBT. I personally was not successful for them to be willing to collaborate. What other options are there?
Yeah, I think there are other options for sure. And CBT, DBT have shown to be effective on the average. Those are the ones that have had randomized trials done, and people who get the intervention arm versus the control arm have about a 50% reduction in risk of suicide attempt. They're not going to be for everyone. They're not going to work for everyone. I think before you give up on those, a really important component of both of them is engagement. And you want to make sure that the person engaging in treatment, whether that be an adolescent, an adult, is really motivated. And related to that, there's a lot of folks, DBT and CBT are manualized treatments that require very specific training. They're not regulated the same way that medications are, where they're produced and put in a bottle and then distributed in that form. There's more diffusion. So there's a lot of people who are saying they're doing DBT who aren't really doing DBT. They weren't trained to do DBT. They don't do the motivational enhancement on the front to make sure people are really bought into it and so on. So I wouldn't give up on them first blush. And I'd make sure that there's a heavy focus and talk to the clinician if you can, or if you're able to, about what they're going to do to try and make sure that the adolescent is on board and bought into the treatment. And that might take 4 sessions, 6 sessions, 8 sessions before the adolescent is fully on board with it. But I think you'll want to. And I know from personal experience, it's hard to do, and again, easier said than done. But do what you can to make sure that you're getting sort of true version of DBT or CBT, and that there is some motivational component ahead of it. And if not, there's other treatments that you might try that are more interpersonally focused. Interpersonal therapy is one of them that was developed decades ago at Columbia University, and is shown to be effective for depression in adolescents. Has a much bigger interpersonal focus. So maybe a connection being formed and focusing on interpersonal relationships might be better for your teen than here's the problem. Let's think about ways of addressing it by teaching you skills. So that kind of approach might work for some people. It might not work as well for others. So interpersonal therapy is one good one that comes to mind. There's also some family-focused interventions around suicide that have shown to have some effect. If there's a sort of willingness to get involved there. Sometimes, and I speak from some personal experience, there's a less of an excitement about getting involved if the family's involved. So I think it's, the science isn't quite there to do precision treatment yet to figure out what's the right treatment for you. So I expect those on the line know their kids best. So, be part of, I would encourage you to be able to be part of the process to pick out what do you think is going to work best for your teen.
So I'm going to veer off for 1 second. You talked about you are a parent.
Mm-hmm.
You're chairman of the psychology department at Harvard. When you talk and guiding your own children and in your own parenting, are there some philosophies that you think are more universal and that you might suggest for all of us, sort of even by way of reminders?
Yeah, I think. And this comes from Marsha Linehan, the developer of DBT. She talked a lot about the importance of validity, validating the experience of the teen, acknowledging, yes, what you're experiencing is hard, and that we don't have the answer. Parents don't have the answers. The chair of the psychology department at Harvard does not have all the answers. I spend my days and nights for the past 25 years thinking about suicide. How do we get better at doing this? And I'm not really good at predicting it and preventing it and treating it. So for parents, give yourselves the space to, know that you don't have to do it all. Those of us who have dedicated our lives to this still aren't able to do it. And to the adolescents, to the families, we're there with you is what I try to encourage, myself and other parents to say. Be with your child, keep communication open, validate, and have humility. We're there to problem solve with them and to get through this with them. And it is hard. Linehan would talk about getting through treatment of suicidal thoughts like climbing out of a ditch, on a hot ladder. She called it getting out of hell on a metal ladder. But, it's hard to do, but if you can do it, you can get out of this situation. Going back to motivation, she would ask patients, this is in her books, you can die, but what if there's a way to feel better? What if there's a way for these problems you're having to go away? And one thing that I found really helpful clinically, and I impart this to patients and loved ones as well, is, did you always have these thoughts? Were things always this bad? And typically the answer is no. Things were better. I didn't have these thoughts. I didn't have these feelings. Great. What if we can get through this and get you back there? Would you be willing to try that? What would you be willing to do to try that? See if you can get motivation to work through and to put in work to try and get things to be better. Because in most cases, it's not going to be easy. It is going to take some working through. And a lot of that comes from this an approach called motivational interviewing. So that's been shown to be really helpful for substance use. The approach used to be, just say no, stop drinking, stop doing drugs. Why do you keep doing it? A motivational interviewing is more, pulling someone along in a glider, acknowledging there are pros, there are benefits to using drugs. It feels really good for a little bit, but there are cons. And let's think about the pros and the cons, and let's have you make a decision about what you want to do. It appears that's much more effective than telling a person what to do. I would encourage us to have the same approach here. What are the pros of the situation you're in? What are the cons of the behaviors you're engaging in? What should we do moving forward collaboratively?
Emily Klein from Boston University is coming in the spring to talk about motivational interviewing.
Oh,
so
perfect.
We'll delve into that. I'm glad about that. So you've helped us with the myths and the truths. There is a myth that when you interview people who are unsuccessful, that they feel this gratitude that they weren't successful. Is that a myth? Is that a truth?
By successful, you mean in dying?
Exactly.
Yeah. No, we've done many interviews of people who have tried to kill themselves and survived, and more often we hear people saying, "I'm glad I survived." And there's an article that was in it wasn't a scientific paper, it was in the New Yorker decades ago, that interviewed people who jumped off the Golden Gate Bridge, which is typically a lethal jump, and 75% of them said as soon as they jumped, they regretted it and wish they didn't do it. And this bears out, and we've done interviews with dozens of suicide attempt survivors who most often say, "I'm glad I survived. I didn't realize that things could be better, and I now see there are people who can help me, and there are treatments available. I wish I didn't go through this suicide attempt to get to where I am now." And so many ways of thinking about this. People are happier that they survived. These thoughts are really terrible and difficult to go through, but they're most often transient. About half of people who have thoughts of suicide never have them again after the first year they've had them. So it's about getting people through them, getting people through that high-risk period, and keeping them alive so they can have a life worth living.
I appreciate all of your words. We will, that is our mission these days as we talk with parents. We need to keep them alive. That is our mission. And love the child in front of you, that child that is right there, not the one you expect, dreamt about. Such brilliant words. I'm so grateful for this time that we had. We'll be back tonight at 7 p.m. Those of you that are listening, make a phone call, text someone. Everyone needs to have this information, and I'm so grateful for you. Thank you, Janet. Thank you, Jericho. Thank you, everybody. Have a good afternoon. Take care.